Here you go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education Tuesday, February 28th. This is our last week before town meeting, and then we have one more week upon our return before we cross over. And we're still on track to move a miscellaneous education bill before crossover, school construction, school safety, and get pre-K language to our friends in Senate Health and Welfare. We did hear from the House that they are passing a miscellaneous education bill to us, so that gives us a little more time to dig into some CTE stuff that we might want to add. We also could add Senator Chittenden's information on kindergarten onto that. And then the House is sending us a universal meals bill. So in talking with the Chair of Agriculture, since it looks like it's coming our way, we decided to wait and take up their bill upon its arrival, which will land in this committee. We'll work with Agriculture on that. Any questions before we get started? Okay. Ms. Wasserman, great to see you. We are looking at an act relating to school construction. I believe we have a copy. This is an updated copy. Not an updated copy.
Yeah, so Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. This is still draft 1.1. There's no bill number yet because it's a committee bill, so it's drafting request 095.
Great, so we will do markup. Let's go through and we can add, subtract, whatever people are comfortable with doing. So hopefully we can make some progress. So please go ahead.
Sure. So this, as a reminder, this bill is creating a school construction aid task force that's looking at issues relating to school construction aid. I can just, it's primarily just a one section bill, section 2 is the effective date. So I can just start on page 1. Subsection A on line 16 is the creation of the task force. So it says there is created the school construction aid task force to examine, evaluate, and report on issues relating to school construction aid. So if there's anything related to the purpose of the task force that you would like to change, this would do that in this subsection.
So let's just pause there for a moment. First of all, thank you, Senator Hewlett. You've been doing the heavy lifting on this. Anything related to the creation that you can think of at this point, or anything else anybody can think of? And I think I'm just looking at you, Ms. Wasserman. If you see, I suspect you haven't, and therefore you haven't raised it, but any conflict with Act 72, anything like that, this is all new information that we would be gathering.
That is correct.
I just want somebody to get on the floor and say, hey, Act 72, this is about to come out, and all this is in there, but clearly that's not the case.
Yes, and when we get there in subsection C on page 3, there is some language that's sort of directing the task force to build on the reports that are coming out of Act 72. Right. So I think the intent is to build on it rather than do the same work that is already being done.
So when we say school construction aid to examine, evaluate, and report on issues relating to school construction, would that also automatically include, Senator Hewlett, might not be the intention, but sources of funds also? Is that what might that come out? Is that part of what we're hoping to get to with this?
I don't think so. I think that would be the word.
It's in the report section.
Oh.
Funding options.
Okay. Where are you?
Page 3.
Yeah, so page 3.
So we have some eager students. I'm still just on the creation. So do we need to match that up in any way? Does that make sense?
This bill is, let me take a second. AOE will be providing reporting back to the General Assembly with a funding report from Act 72. And the intent is to build off of that funding report and have this task force look at that and come up with sort of funding options and sources that can include sources of funds. and incentives as part of that plan. So,
So that creation makes sense to you and to everybody, that feels pretty good.
yes, and I think you could, expand it further just to add in, what that would include, relating to school construction, including, funding, funding and governance of a program or something to that effect, if you wanted to clarify that further. Because this task force will also be tasked with coming up with a governance structure for the program.
I was gonna say, I mean, how granular do you want to get here? Because really,
The look you just gave me was.
I
No,
I mean,
get
you
it.
could have like 100-page bill.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, and I'd love to get up to at least 90, but
So I think
Yeah.
this could cover it. It's just
Okay.
if you wanted to be more
Good.
specific.
no, I just think of floor stuff, what people might ask, that sort of thing. If we're all good, we're all good.
One suggestion that I had from someone was this is small, but we all know that messaging and storytelling are really important. So someone said, can you change the name from School Construction Aid Task Force to School Transformation Commission or School Transformation Committee?
Oh my gosh,
Or-
I almost teared up. That is,
Sorry.
no, yeah,
I know, it's very, but I mean, it is a little more.
of what it
The
is.
scope is bigger and it is more of what it is. Yeah. We are trying to.
Would you repeat that
transform.
title? Yeah.
School Transformation Commission or School Transformation, I like commission better than committee personally.
How do people feel? I mean,
It's a little ambiguous, transformation.
could you say
We're not dealing with, we're talking about construction.
construction?
And I also think commissions tend to, since this is a temporary task
Okay.
force, I think a commission is more
The
of a
commission is is the thing.
sort
that
of a
they're gonna-
long-term. Yeah, so I see a commission as maybe a result coming out of a recommendation for the governance structure.
Okay.
But
Senator Hutchins?
I was just gonna say, I think, the last time we had a school transformation, it was Act 46, and I don't think, I don't know that we wanna revisit. No, I appreciate,
That
respect the idea of,
Okay.
the storytelling or,
Mhm.
communication of the issue, but I think, it's construction, and I like this.
Okay.
being-
Is that okay with you?
Fair, yeah.
Okay.
Well, like something to the effect of like construction and renovation, or construction and sustain, something bigger than just construction. But it's smaller than transformation.
Construction, renovation, and sustainability.
I like that.
I'm looking at a reasonable timeline too, is that, what are we gonna give it, a 5-year time period between the time we know how much it's gonna cost, what school buildings need to be replaced? I want to just put it into context, how long, because sometimes boards and commissions end up being just nebulous entities, and we already have it, 160.
Yeah, this one has an end date, so, yeah,
Okay,
but I know what you're saying. I know some of that, it's, yeah. So we'll get to
yeah,
that.
so this does have an end date, and I think construction would cover renovation. I think maybe instead of sustainability, do you mean like maintenance? Is that the term?
Instead of,
Construction and maintenance, I mean, that doesn't sound.
Oh, and I think that maybe construction can cover sort of renovation and maintenance, because it's not saying like new construction. If you wanted to keep it, a
I
smaller.
mean, what are we talking about for, S5 passes, now we're gonna have to have a timeline for replacing all the fossil fuel boilers they've got, so I'm saying is, we need a plan, how much is it gonna cost?
Right, and the good news is some of that's all gonna get pulled out of this, so we can go into it, to your good point, with some kind of, more information, if you will, yeah. Senator Dooley.
If we follow the Rhode Island model, there will have to be kind of a permanent commission set that will over time be looking and examining at school construction and renovation issues over time. I don't know if they would have an end date or what it would be, but this is just kind of like a first step in a longer process.
So,
If
yeah.
we're following that model.
So what we did was, so this will kind of get that going, and then the legislature will decide, a commission, and we're gonna need some group to kind of monitor what's happening out there.
It's a
So, yeah,
full-time job for sure.
yeah, Senator Weeks.
So this report creates recommendations for the governance structure, for the oversight and management, blah, 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 of the program. This only dedicates enough money to do the report. Period. And then it dies. That's the intent. It's not, hey, this isn't a 5, 10, 50-year program. This is.
Which I think, again, your good point is it gives us more information so that before we take the next step, we have it. Yeah, okay. So are we okay with construction?
Are we doing anything, I don't know if it comes into this, but are we doing anything to lift the moratorium that was put in place in 2007? So that when this actually happens, we can start construction?
Good question. We can have that conversation. I'm looking to.
Yeah, so I think that you can't just lift the moratorium without, and have that program be operational, just by saying, you can go ahead, because there's sort of staffing and resource issues at AOE. And I think what this is saying is you want to come up with a new program, rather than the way that other one operated. The state is looking at how do we come up with a new program with new criteria and incentives, because that program operated in a specific way with certain eligible costs and certain percentages of awards. And so I think what this is looking at is saying, is that still the best way to operate a program, or do we want to think of it differently? But even if you wanted to go back to the way it was operating, I think they would testify on this, but I think that they don't have their resources, and there's no funding source. They don't have the sort of staff resources to operate the program, and there would be no funding source from that program.
I hear what you're saying. I think that, again, governance is part of that, and that comes out of the report. But I do agree, Senator Sheen, that we need to basically reflect on what the legislative landscape is that would inhibit the next steps.
Yeah.
And that's not in the deliverables 1 through 4. It's not called out there. It needs something to that effect of, we have a moratorium, and how do we positively recognize and affect that moratorium?
So I think the task force, the report that is coming back to the General Assembly, or to the education committees and Ways and Means and Finance, is asking for recommendations for legislative action. So nothing can really happen, it's on page 4, lines 1 through 3. So the General Assembly will have to take an action to repeal that old program and, put in language to create a new program. But what that program would be, the idea is that this task force would be saying, and maybe even coming up with language to say, here is our proposal, and then the General Assembly will have to decide if they accept that proposal and enact that change.
Yes.
Do we want a date around that at all? Around the proposal for recommendation for legislative action?
Yeah, so the report is due January 15th of 2024. And so the idea was that it would come back in time for the 2024 legislative session, so that the General Assembly could take action next session once they have what the proposal is.
So we don't need to get more specific than that.
So in seeing page 4, line 2 and 3, findings and recommendations for legislative action, I think that findings and recommendations for legislative action actually belongs in on page 3 in the report outline. That one of the fifth one should be the recommendations for action, recommendations for legislative action
So
as
just,
a deliverable.
yeah, so can you say what page?
Yeah, so taking page 4,
Yeah.
line 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Findings and any recommendations for legislative action. And that actually should go into page 3, starting line 3. And then see on line 7, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 deliverables in the report, but that becomes a fifth deliverable.
After criteria for prioritizing school.
Yeah. It's just- It's what Senator Sheen said. And I agree with you. You have to know what the landscape is and what the recommendation is.
Looking at any concerns with that? Does it change
So-
the intent? Does it change?
Subsection C is listing sort of what the committee is studying. So they'd be studying all of these issues relating to school construction. The report, I guess it is generally written, just generally saying any recommendations for legislative action. So typically we would put the deliverable in what the report is. So we could be more specific in the report about, a proposal for a new school construction program in there. If that is what and any legislative language or something more specific, if that is what the committee is looking for. I can add something more specific in the list of what the committee is studying, but
So recommendation, page 3, line 6, instead of ending with a colon, end with line report that outlines colon, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and now potentially 5. I mean, that's the outline of the report. You're trying to give the task force the general outline, not the answers, just the outline.
Yes, Mr. Fisher.
For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education, and the Agency Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. And only if it's helpful, Mr. Chair, I just thought I would look under the hood a little bit of our legislative report process. So what you're referring to, Senator, above, in terms of the list in C, that tends to be when a working group of this scope is stood up, that's their challenge. That's what they start working on in terms of meetings. What ends up in E, that is quite literally a signal to me and my staff about how to structure the report. So if you tell us to put findings and any recommendations for legislative action, you're going to get back a section that says recommendations or recommendations for legislative action. If you tell us to draft language, you'll get a section that has draft language, for example. Now, I ask that you don't put too much specificity in the reports because we do a lot of these and it gives us some flexibility in terms of how we structure them in a way that's workable for it. But generally speaking, what the senator's referring to on the top, it tends to be what the committee reviews, and then what is in E. And I think Becky was trying to say that. I just want to say that is how we interpret it. We look at subsection E when we draft, and the committee reviews the whole section. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying it doesn't really matter to us. If you put legislative action in there somewhere, you'll get legislative action back. The only other thing I'll just note, with your permission, to Senator Bulick's question a moment ago, there are two sort of traditional dates that gets given to us in terms of legislative reports. One is the 15th of December and one is the 15th of January. Generally speaking, we prefer and recommend the 15th of January, even though it gives you guys a very close turnaround because you're already in session by the time you receive the report. The reason why we ask for that additional month is that the bill will be signed. It will go to the governor. There will be about a 1-month delay as it clears this building to get to the governor. The governor will sign it. It will then become law whenever the effective date is that you say, and then we will establish the committee. Between summertime schedules, vacations and all of that, we'll get our first meeting in usually August or September. And then it gives the task force a couple of months of meetings to try to get the work done. So it's a really quick turnaround time. If it's December 15th, it's a slightly better, doable, but still very quick turnaround time for January 15th. So
And I would,
ask for that extra month. Go ahead, sorry.
I would add to that, and you could speak to this too, that the committee is relying on other reports that are due from Act 72, and I believe those aren't coming until later in the fall. So the committee, the task force can't do some of their work until they receive that information. So if the date is earlier, I think it creates more of a crunch time for the task force to actually get the work done. So just wanted to make that point as well.
I had heard the reports coming out in October. Is that still?
Act 72, correct?
The Act 72 reports, I know the funding report, I think the latest I heard was October, but I don't know, AOE has a change to that. And then the assessment, I'm not sure when that is going to be completed.
That was October also, but
I mean, the list, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my impression as well.
Yeah, so if the task force doesn't get that information until October, the December timeline is
Tight.
very tight, yeah. Okay.
And we have January 15th. So just one second, Senator.
Okay.
So just to make sure, so we're on the same page, is there something, where are we around this fifth recommendation? Are we moving it over, adding a fifth? Is that what people are comfortable with?
It's already in there.
Yeah.
Relocate.
Right, it's just
I'll overtime. It's not that, it's not important. I do think,
Okay,
so I misread the powers versus the report.
okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
All right.
You're both, it seems like you were
We're all
worried that the
gonna get the same
moratorium was
spot.
gonna be.
Yeah, that was really it. I mean, I was just thinking 2 years down the road or 4 years down the road, when whoever's sitting in this committee is really getting into the work of doing this, and they're thinking, oh, right, we have to lift this moratorium. How do we do that? Yeah. So, yeah, just want to make the path clear.
No, I'm glad you did, because it's one of those things that I wasn't really clear on until you asked the question. I just thought, oh, the moratorium, simple little thing, but when you just mentioned it and got the response, I didn't realize the complicated piece of it. Senator Weiss,
Wait,
I'm sorry, Williams, sorry.
No, I was just wondering if
Please.
1 January, or 15 January 2024 is going to have enough information to do the report.
I think we're gonna be okay, because they're gonna finish all the other reports in October. It's gonna be tight, but I'm sure the Agency of Education will be able to hustle, as they've proven themselves in the past. But yeah, fair question. Senator Joy,
I actually think, Mr. Ted wanted to speak.
you get priority if you want to, Senator Joy, but I just want to make sure.
I was just gonna say that this group is starting to meet this coming summer, so they're gonna be a well-oiled machine by the time those reports come out, and I
That's a
think
great point.
they'll be able to hit the ground running.
So when are we going to get the status reports on the construction costs?
All, this will pull some of that stuff apart for us, what the costs look like. Yeah. Mr. Fisher.
Again, Ted Fisher, I'm not an attorney, and so therefore I think your counsel's advice would be better on this. But I do know from some historical memory in the building with regard to the moratorium, if you go to reestablish a school construction, that moratorium means that is current law. The school construction program is current law. If you lift the moratorium, it will exist again. And that might, yes, we would not be prepared to implement it in terms of our staffing, but it would also allow school districts to start requesting funds, of which none are budgeted. And so we would prefer that you not lift the moratorium without having a program in place. And I think it's my understanding that if you go to establish a new program, you would be amending, either removing the moratorium or amending the underlying law that the moratorium is stopping. So I think we would be, and we would, it's in our, we would hopefully, as members of this commission, bring forward a recommendation that would mean the moratorium would go away. So we want to see it done well and right.
That's correct. It's sort of the school construction aid program still exists in statute, it's just, for all purposes, not operational right
Right.
now, so, you know, you can, the
Well, we know
General
people are
Assembly can,
building,
yeah,
some
the General
people-
Assembly can speak and lift that at any time. It's just whether or not it could actually sort of operate as a program without, you know,
Without
yeah.
funds, et cetera. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please continue.
so subsection B is the membership of the committee, of the task force.
Let's just go through that.
Okay, so there is a House and Senate member, let's
You
see,
really want to spend your summer this way, Senator Cooley?
Yes, I do.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
there's the state treasurer and the secretary of education or designees will serve as the co-chairs. Then you have the ED of the MEA, the Vermont Principals Association.
And again, all these, or they can designate
Or
somebody.
designations,
Yep.
yeah. The School Boards Association, the Superintendent's Association, and the bond bank.
So just related to this, for example, if the Vermont Principals Association, could they designate a principal? Or is it somebody from their organization? Do we,
And it leaves it open, I mean, the
Okay.
executive director. It appoints the executive director or whoever they designate.
okay. So I'm just looking to, sorry if you would, sorry to be on the spot with this, but so just thinking, are we good? You know, so we've got Jay Nichols, we know Jay knows all the principals, who'll bring their voices forward. Okay, or he may designate a certain principal that he thinks should be on, okay?
Or, I mean, he could really designate anybody, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you could donate, designate, yeah.
so if you guys are okay with that,
Yeah, I just want to make sure you felt like those voices, principals on the ground. Great, thank you.
There is also the president of the Vermont School Custodians and Maintenance Association or
Right.
designee. There is,
By the way, while just we're on that, Abe, at some point, it'd be great for us to hear from the school custodians in general after we're all sober, just so we can get to know them. Please, go ahead.
a person with expertise in historic preservation, and that person would be appointed by the governor. And then a person with expertise in the construction industry, specializing in school facilities projects, and that person would also be appointed by the governor. And then finally, a member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association, appointed by the governor.
I mean, it strikes me as a really good list of people, very comprehensive. We've had a lot of softballs on the Senate floor, no questions, nothing like that. You know, this will all change, and that's just my mindset right now. Are we missing anybody? Does all of a sudden somebody not want somebody on it? But this feels like, based on our conversations, we've come up with a good list. And this will have to go to appropriations, and please know that they may tinker with
So
Senator.
what you talked about, a representative for the ADA, Americans with Disabilities. And then did we talk further about rolling that in because it was going to be included in another one of these?
I'm really glad you raised that. You did raise that before, a member of the American Disabilities Association. And is there somebody in there that can do that work? I do remember this conversation. I thought we might have responded by saying there, that representation might fall in under one of these individuals.
I mean, I think a person with expertise in construction, in the construction industry, specializing in school facilities projects might have that experience. But you might, if you wanted to specifically name someone with that experience, you could do that as well.
Is there anything else in the bill that would address Senator Williams' good point that, you know, we don't, you know, this would, you know, that this is going to be looked at, that this issue is going to be considered. I think generally, given the ADA, these things are going to be looked at. Is there
So,
anything in particular?
yeah, so I think the school facilities assessment that is ongoing right now, I can the copy of Act 72, it should be looking at those types of needs in a school building. Yes, so Act 72 requires in the assessment of a school building that they are looking at and ranking, prioritizing school needs. And one of the categories they're looking at is accessibility. So I think the information that will be coming back to the task force will include needs of the school, and one of the categories will be accessibility. So there should be some data points about what schools have those needs. That being said, you could certainly add another member to the committee.
No, too many.
You're okay?
books.
Okay,
Well,
just want to make sure you're okay with
We
it.
could
Yeah.
roll the bottle filling station in there too somewhere.
I know.
That's right. Sounds good.
Thank you. I was just gonna say to Senator Williams that when, that governance structure is gonna be really key. So I think when we get to that number 3, sometime in the future, that there should be a person who has that lens on that governance structure for sure. I think that would be like the crucial place for that kind of representation to be.
It's included, but it's not a big deal to me. I mean, are there federal guidelines what a school building has to be?
Yeah.
So probably that would be dictated.
Yeah.
There are, but sometimes the federal guidelines don't go far enough. So to have representation, I think is a really good point.
Good. Okay. Please continue.
Subsection C on page 3, it looks at the powers and duties of the committee, the task force. And this is where there's language that says the task force will be reviewing the results of the inventory and condition assessment and the school construction funding report that's coming out in Act 72. And then there's a list of the items that the committee will be studying. So first is the needs, both programmatic and health and safety of statewide school construction projects. And I would point out this is perhaps another area where accessibility. But the second is funding options for a statewide school construction program, including any incentive plans. Third is a governance structure for the oversight and management of the school construction aid program. And then finally, criteria for prioritizing school construction funding.
Not seeing any concerns or questions.
Okay, so subsection D of the bill speaks to the assistance that will be provided to the task force. They will have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of AOE and the Office of the State Treasurer. The treasurer is also authorized to contract for services for the task force for technical assistance from a school construction expert. Subsection E is the reporting requirement. The date the report is due is January 15th, 2024. The report would go to the House institutions, education, and Ways and Means committees, and the Senate committees on education, finance, and institutions, and would include any findings and recommendations for legislative action. Subsection F is the meetings requirement. The state treasurer is tasked with calling the first meeting. That would occur by July 15th of this year. The majority of the membership will constitute a quorum. And then this question came up earlier about how long the task force will exist. And so this has an date of July 1st, 2024. So it would the task force would stay on a few months after their report is due, sort of through the legislative session. Subsection G is the compensation and reimbursement. The Legislative members of the task force would be entitled to per diem compensation reimbursement of expenses for not more than 10 meetings, and that comes out of the money appropriated to the legislative budget. The other members.
And just for new members, new senators, that's generally what we will do.
Yeah. The other members of the task force would also be entitled to per diem compensation reimbursement for 10 meetings. That comes out of money appropriated to the Office of the State Treasurer. This is an area where the Appropriations Committee will look at whether certain additional appropriation would need to be made to the Treasurer's office to support that.
And just so everyone knows, what we would do is when this is voted out later this week or upon return, Senator Hewlett, as this, really somebody who's led us through this, go to appropriations, walk them through this with you in attendance, with Ms. Wasserman, and kind of just make the case and just answer some questions for them. And, generally, they stay out of the policy, but not always. So we try to encourage them to stay out of the policy. But, yeah, thank you.
And
The
then
good
finally,
news is, just make fun. If they voted out unanimously, what I would suspect they would, if you think about it, Bobby Starr always told me, you're really always counting on 16. You got 5 in here, 7 down there, you're getting in pretty good shape by the time you're right.
so finally, the appropriation in subsection H is 200,000 to the state treasurer and general funds. And that is available for them to hire a construction expert to assist the task force.
Where did we come up with that number? That kind of a placeholder that I need to heat back to JFO on?
You might want to, when I met with, if I may.
Yeah, please.
When I met with the treasurer and some other folks, we had actually said 100,000. But then on Senator Weeks' input, we decided to bump that up. So
I think there's testimony also from the NEA about increasing it. So I had increased
I do remember
it
this back and forth. Yeah.
based on the comment, but
Could we ask you to run it by JFO? That number? That
sure.
would be great,
Yeah.
and then they'll come back and often, and that's something they'll ask you in appropriations, it's JFO giving you a guesstimate.
And I think the treasurer testified to this, that $100,000 was appropriated for the pension task force. So I think that's how they originally came up with the $1,000 that they had suggested. But I don't know that it was anyone ever did like a cost analysis.
Yeah, and they have so many different experiences in JFO they can cross this with to see what. Doesn't mean we would land on where they are, but it would just, everybody's gonna ask it on the floor in appropriations, as JFO gave you.
Okay, and then section 2 is the effective date, so this would take effect on passage. Exciting.
Very exciting. Questions or comments? Just please.
Curiosity question based on your experiences. Is one individual sufficient to create essentially, well, let me backtrack.
Yeah.
What does it take to really get one of these reports done where it's the principals who are on the committee probably aren't really writing the report. They're all of their day jobs. Who actually produces the report? Is that the intent of the appropriation, that that particular person is the one who generates the report?
It's an excellent question. You're right. None of us generally on these committees do we sit down. Oftentimes it's ledge council, or it's in this case, I think we'd be talking out, well, like you answered.
So there is typically language where the assistant subsection of the bill, where it talks about the task force having the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of AOE and the Office of the State Treasurer. That is typically who the staff would be drafting a report or
Okay.
proposal.
But if we give the department a task, we don't fund us the manpower to do the study, we're gonna get what we get. We're not gonna get, you know, the intent of what we think we're gonna get. That's my first blush. Again, I'm not a government guy, right? I've been on the receiving end of tasks to analyze, to staff a problem.
Yeah.
And we get staff, we have a deliverable, we have expectations, we deliver. But it costs money in the private sector. I'm just wondering if, okay, so we're hiring a person to represent the construction industry. I think that's appropriate. But are we really going to get a well-staffed board if we don't put money behind the department to
So
actually
that-
execute?
That is the idea of the technical assistance, so that $200,000 to hire somebody to do. I mean, it could be legal analysis or any other type of technical assistance that's needed for the
Okay.
committee. I can't speak to whether AOE needs additional resources or the Office of the Treasurer needs additional resources to provide any staff assistance.
It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Should we spell that out?
I mean, it would be, I think, the way you would reflect it in the bill would be an appropriation to those, to AOE and the treasurer's office for, you know, I don't know if it would be a position, I don't know what they would be requesting.
Right, and generally, and so what I would recommend is, why don't we have AOE and the treasurer's office weigh in on this question with us to see if, to Senator Weeks' good question, hey, what are we gonna get? What do you guys need in order for us to get what we really want, which is a top-notch report? And we could have them come in later this week so that we can move this, you know, sometimes. How's that feel?
So this is gonna last for generations, so.
Right, the
Yeah.
commission itself would, and the buildings, we certainly hope so.
Mr. Panos said, my father said.
Yeah. Can't afford.
It'll be cheap.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
So we gotta make sure. How much you gonna charge for it? How long you wanna work at it?
Well compensated.
Yeah.
So.
Are you getting the 200,000?
Yeah, that's part of the deal.
Well, if this bill were to go today, back to Senator Weeks's question, and who would we be relying on for this report? A combination of AOE and the treasurer's office.
Right,
And AOE would likely, I'm just predicting what they may see when they come in, hey, we've got this, we're covered, we don't need additional funds, but they may come in and say, hey, in order for us to do this, we might need an extra person. Or some additional funds for somebody to do this extra work, something like that. And the treasurer will have treasurer paycheck in to talk about that $200,000 also.
Right, so the treasurer, the $200,000 would be for whoever they contract
Right.
with. If you know, the treasurer might also say they need additional staff support. I would say it's not as typical to hire a position for,
A
you know,
study.
a
I understand.
study committee.
This is a big, you never know, this is a big deal.
Mhm.
And, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, Act 72 did hire, there's a limited service positions that were created for some of the work in Act 72. So that's an example of, I think those were 2-year positions for some of that work, so.
and it might at the very least get them thinking about the commission, and whether or not they're gonna need somebody long-term to also monitor all the work that the commission's doing. So we'll have them in this week to talk about those two things. Those seem like the big outstanding questions along with joint fiscal. Thank you for writing to them, Senator Weeks.
So this is more of a curiosity question for our Department of
Education.
Education representative. So is there actually a mix of experience where bills pay the department for this type of analysis versus just generically giving a sum of money to execute a study, and then you guys figure out how you execute? Does it matter if in the end, whether it's an in-house person or you contract outside?
forward. Director Fisher.
Yeah, for the record, Ted Fisher, Agency of Education. It's highly variable on the report, and I would, specific to this report, I'd want us to come back with what we might need specifically for this report. And I'll just say this is my team is the last team to touch reports, and we're also responsible for making sure that they're tracked and timely submitted. We have reports that we owe you that we haven't submitted yet. Generally speaking, and I'm about to come and ask you to potentially add another one to us in my testimony in a few minutes. So generally speaking, when, like, for example, this report, without speaking on behalf of the agency about the topic, because I said we'll come back in, we want to provide and work together on these issues, right? So we can often absorb a lot of those costs, but generally speaking, the costs of reports are almost entirely unbudgeted, are absorbed by the agency. The number of reports that are created does not commensurately have a resource increase. We have seen a really large increase in the last 2 years. Honestly, what I'd love to do in a utopian moment where I have, you know, a couple of free days is literally just take a look at how many reports we've been assigned over the past couple of years and track the trends there. I know that in my team, production of a relatively good size legislative report costs somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 in staff salaries alone. But the salaries is, and that's just to read, proofread, edit, draft an executive summary, manage approvals, and submit. It's a lot of work. It is a lot of work worth doing. That's why you sometimes see, I don't have a good poker face. You might see me make a face when you're talking about another report, purely because it's just adding resources to our plate. But we expect to receive a certain number every year and manage them. And we asked for and received a position last year, which is Lindsay. You've met in part because the number of legislative requests has increased over the past few years. So my hope is that we're going to have a better process for managing them next year. But it is something I appreciate that you're thinking about it, certainly, because it is whenever you ask for a report, it does have a resource cost associated with it. And sometimes internally, it's a large resource cost for some of our teams because they have to go and do, you know, yes, in some cases you can hire a consultant, but in some cases you really can't. You just have to assign the team to do that work. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Really appreciate your help with this and Senator Lewis's work on it. Mr. Fisher. Committee, recall last week we talked with Brody and others around driver's education and asked the agency to come back and weigh in on the situation that was outlined, And so we have some testimony here in your files from Secretary French, and Senator Fisher is going to read that testimony with us.
Director Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education. I'm the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. I'm very glad to be with you, and Secretary French sends his regards and his regrets. I promised myself I wouldn't make a joke about being a poor vehicle for my boss, since we're talking about driver's education, but I guess I just did that in that kind of day. So very specifically, you should have this testimony in front of you. I'm going to sort of paraphrase as we go through in the interest of time. But as I think you are aware from some of your previous testimony, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on driver's education have been pretty significant. And one of the sort of, I think, the biggest challenge we face right now is the shortage of driver educators. So we've been at the agency looking at some ways to expand access to these programs without compromising safety. So there's two parts of driver's education. There's the in-car and the in-classroom. On the in-classroom side, we've been working with the Standards Board for Professional Educators, which we support in our education quality division, our licensing team, to create a new license endorsement for the classroom portion of driver's education. Hoping that this is an attractive opportunity for teachers who are already licensed in other areas. they might not be interested in teaching behind the wheel, but they might be able to take on for an additional stipend, the task of doing a classroom instruction portion. But that doesn't address the clinical or behind the wheel portion of the program, and that's more challenging. Secretary French spoke with Commissioner Manoli this week from DMV. We think there's an opportunity to deliver regional drivers clinics pattern on the motorcycle safety program. And Secretary French is a motorcyclist. I'm not, but I did review it, and it does appear that there's a really sort of robust series of clinics and driver safety programs that occur on a regular basis around the state. So our thought is kind of potentially to do something structured similarly.
Senator Williams, are you a motorcyclist? You do, you are as well. So, okay, so you too. Senator, you?
No.
No, so we do have a couple people in here. Good.
So don't rely on me.
Yeah, no, we have these two
But we
gentlemen.
are asking, and to your point, Senator Weeks, we are asking that AOE and DMV be directed to work with interested school districts to develop a model regional driver clinic program. The goal would be to develop a model program this summer with the intention of implementing the pilot in the summer of 2024. And we are requesting an appropriation of $200,000 from the Ed Fund, or we are suggesting that an appropriation of $200,000 can be made from the Education Fund to support this planning work.
Senator Sheen.
Thank you. So the first question I have that comes to mind is why ask for 200 grand from the education fund instead of the transportation fund, or why not down the middle, 100 from the education, 100 from transportation? Because this does seem more in the transportation
I'm
sector.
not sure about the transportation fund versus the general funds. Generally speaking, you don't use transportation fund dollars, but the thought behind Ed Fund is that this might ultimately, we have a challenge that we can't find enough teachers, right? But if we had the teachers, this would be a local education spending, so it'd be reflected in the education fund. So the thought is to use the education fund to try to come up with an alternative that school districts that would use in place of local education spending.
It's a great question, though. I mean, really, is there some role there for from even DMV funds, where there's training, that sort of thing? And I think however we send it out, probes will play with it. And I think it's a really good point that maybe if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Fisher, looking into that for us to see if we could slice this a little bit. You have a follow-up?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, the rationale behind me asking is, I've had a number of constituents who just said they'd like to see less things being taken out of the education funds and have it be more narrowly focused to education K through 12. I mean, I understand the nexus and the connection here, but it's trying to reflect what my constituents are trying.
I think it's a great point. And there may be DMV education funds that we just don't know about. And I think it's really worthwhile looking into for sure. And yeah, so
We can absolutely look into it. We do have, there's sort of a model that the General Assembly has made for the education fund in terms of what is education spending and what isn't. And I pulled out our budget book here. The House has not released the budget yet, but we did give our budget presentation.
yeah,
And I will share a copy with you, Mr. Chair, in case you would like to read it. We have some language, I'll pull that language out for why. So we think that fits within, in terms of education spending, but I'm open to
Yeah,
other
would you
funding
look into
sources,
your-
absolutely.
friend Commissioner Manoli,
Absolutely.
would you reach out to her? She's great, and
We'll follow
there
up.
might be something there. And I think Senator Hashim's point is well taken. I mean, if there's something there, if there's a source, let's use it. Senator Williams.
Thank you. Friday, we had testimony about training the trainers.
Yep.
So getting an endorsement on for maybe doing it through the state university system. I'd like to have that address too. On the AOE thinks about that.
You can have Secretary French or designate back in this week to talk a little bit about that as well. Senator Weeks.
So I really thought that train the trainer was the intent of what we're considering here. And just reading it over a couple times, I don't pull that out of the understanding from the agency that that's what you're responding to. So it's kind of like, how do we, to provide the additional in-vehicle and in-classroom trainers for the students, it's really about what's the best method to train the trainers, whether it's, through universities, through separate train the trainer, call it an academy, call it what you want. But I thought that was kind of the rich. So the problem, we're trying to solve a problem. The problem is there's not enough instructors, right? So the question is, well, how do we? And I've read this through a couple times, but I don't really see that. To Senator Williams' point, it's really about how do you train the trainers? How do you fill the gap that we currently have, which is a lack of trainers.
And just so I have it in my head, we're talking about how do we train the people that will train the teachers who will then train the students.
Understood. I'm sorry, I unfortunately missed the testimony that you heard last week. This is again meeting a poor vehicle for Secretary French. We're recommending this as an additional option, I guess, on top of that consideration. I can go back and try and get some more information about how, we're doing that. We are working on the in classroom side of things. I'm not sure what the educational pipeline looks like for the driver's educators to do the on-road training, but I can get more information about that.
Would you mind doing that, coming back tomorrow? We don't, you're doing a great job with it, Ted. You're in the thick of it. Maybe you could just help us pull this apart a little bit. My guess is we'll get somewhere with this and we'll end up in the miscellaneous education bill. It's the most natural vehicle, and it would be nice to be able to do it before crossover. But so tomorrow, if you could come in for
Absolutely.
20 minutes and just answer some of those questions, that would be great.
I'm happy to get some more of that information. I don't know if we'll take a position on the trainer in that time frame, but I'll do my best to see what we about that.
Yes.
It's just a question, is driver's ed mandatory for licensing? No?
For receiving an educator or a driver's license, I believe so, yes. I don't think it's mandatory for students to take.
Right, so you don't have to, it's not a high school,
requirement.
it's not a high school graduation requirement.
But it is a
But if you want to drive, in the old days,
Right.
it's not how I learned how to drive, it was different. That's why I have a great record. Sir, great to see you again.
Thank you.
How does this feel to you? Would you introduce yourself for the record?
Yes, Joseph Barch. I'm president of the American Driver Traffic Safety Education Association.
Yep.
Really, I've come down to physically be here to listen to the testimony,
Yep.
give whatever aid that I can. The proposal for a regional model is news to me, so I probably would have to go and talk to my colleagues to see how they feel about that. And there have been in some other states, either Idaho or Montana, have tried something similar. I don't know what the results of those were. I could ask that question at a meeting later on today with the my national board. And to answer the question, in the state of Vermont, in order to get a license before the age of 18, you have to take a 36-and-6 program. So
We're talking about credentialing teachers so that they could have 2 credentials. That would be incredible. I realize it's putting more, but for those that might be interested, would you mind working a little bit together? That would be great. So that when we see something, maybe tomorrow, we could have some questions answered and things will be fleshed out a little bit more. Great. Okay. Anything else on driver's ed? Great. Some more questions, please, Senator Williams.
No, just my point was
Yeah.
that if it's a requirement,
Yeah.
then we've got to provide the resources for them to meet that requirement.
Right. You mean if it's required, as it is now in the state? So if I had an 18-year-old, he or she would have to. Yeah, and the resources, I think, really, you could take it at school for free, likely, or maybe some fee. And that would be on the parents, I think. So now we,
Yes, sir. I'm just curious. I lost a 4mm wrench the other day, and I'm wondering if our guest is wearing it as his tie clip.
I love it, it's great.
Yes,
great.
it's a 1/4 inch.
Very good, very good.
That's great.
But likewise, yes, it's for free, provided by the public
Oh,
schools.
thank you.
Commercially, and I wear both hats. There's a charge. It can be anywhere from about $800 to a little over $1,000 per student.
Great. Okay, really appreciate the two of you working together. Would love to get that fleshed out. We always give a driver's ed award every year. Ted, I think you're heading in that direction. You're knocking out of the park. So, all right, thank you. Okay, let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back to Board Yank. Yeah.
Tammy told me you were coming. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to connect before.
Smells just.
Good, how are you?
That leaves you 15 minutes.
And